Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin our presentation, and my name is Oleksandr Filonenko. I am the editor of the IST Publishing house, and this year and last year we have published two books by Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, who has joined us today. And I would like to start our meetings with saying two important things. First of all, I want to recall the whole story of it in one minute, and just to thank all of the people who have supported our project at different stages. The thing is that the story with this book has started in Ukraine, well, at least has started from me at around 10 years ago, since the moment when Sep has come to us, has come to visit Kharkiv to discuss the concept of the presence that was at this point, as for us as being philosophers, artists, representative of the humanitarian communities, was an important answer to everything that is currently going on in the field of culture. That was an answer for us of how we can today speak of arts and culture. 3 years ago, together with the IST Publishing house, together with Katerina Nusko and Anastasia Leonova, we have been dreaming that we will be able to translate this book and to bring this book into Ukraine. And we have been working for this project for around 2 years. And there is a huge list of people who have joined our team to make it possible. The project has been supported by loads of people. If those people didn't support us, this project would have never happened at all if they didn't support us. And I would like to thank Igor and Tetiana Sukhoruk, who has supported us at the very beginning of this process when we have just considering taking this book into our portfolio. I'm really grateful to Jevhen Halyona, who has supported the communication at the very first week of our work, and also the translation of this book has been supported by European Union with the program House of Europe and the Mizhvuhamy in Between Years Foundation that supported us also. By the way, we're located here today in the premise of the foundation. They supported us at the end of our work for this project, and this book has become a very important work for us. And I would like to also list out the people who helped us to have this book. So please welcome today we have Ivan Ivashchenko, the translator of the book. And we also had numerous editors who have been working. We have Vyacheslav Tsiba, we had Alexander Stukala working on that, we have Irina Troskar, who has done the literature edition of it, and everyone who is aware of his publishing already, you know that we are very, very tedious about building the covers of our books. We're working with distinguished designers, and the 3Z studio has been working to design the cover of this book, and we believe they managed to give the all essence of the book, create a book that will speak of the presence first of all and about the senses. On the other hand, also we're also really grateful to Katerina Bolshakova and Varvara Perekhrest, who have been working on the editorial panels of this book. I hope that I've managed to mention everyone. There's 2 years of our work we're presenting today. This is the very first presentation that we're making, and we have this pleasure and honor to discuss together this book with Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, the book that has already turned out 15 last year. I've said that I'm not going to be speaking with a lot of pathos about this book, and we're going to listen to the author. Why? Because the concept of the presence that he says in the introduction is already slightly not the main sphere of his interest currently, but we will discuss it further on today. So please welcome once again Ivan Ivashchenko, the translator of this book, Jevhen Halyona, and Oleksandr Filonenko, who is the philosopher from Kharkiv, who is actually the person who started from 2000, who have been developing the Konononias workshop in Kharkiv, who have published Gumbrecht's text in Russian interpretation, in Russian translation, and Jevhen is going to be the moderator today for this meeting. That's all from our side. Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you very much for joining us here. So I'm pleased to welcome all of you who have joined us and who has created this nice intimate presence today in this room among this audience. For me, and I do believe that for all of the people who are currently here with me, I do understand that this is a kind of celebration today. You know, it's a holiday event for me. You know, there's a celebration and celebration of Kharkiv in Kiev today because the Kharkiv Publishing House, a translator from Kharkiv, and it all have started in Kharkiv. So the design is also has been made in Kharkiv. So basically, that is a certain celebration for all of us from Kharkiv. Even though Sapir said that's for him, that's already the stage that he has already closed for himself, but for us it is still a very important milestone, a very important book, and it is a great event for me that this book has finally been published in Ukrainian. And what is also important for me that it all has been done in Kharkiv. I You haven't been based in Kharkiv at this moment, but we still consider you being from Kharkiv. That was the comment to Ivan. But basically, that's a big honor for me to be today the main moderator of all of this event, of all of our presentation. I will explain you why, because basically the publication of this book in some way is a personal story from my side also, and I will try to be very brief about how we got to this idea, how we got to this need to translate this book. In 2007, for the very first time, we've finally knew that Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht is there, that he exists, and I do believe that Oleksandr tell us more about that, and we have decided that we need to discuss this text at our own workshop. That was one of the first discussions in our workshops that we've had, and for us, Gumbrecht has become one of the key authors. And quite naturally, when we have decided that our workshop has grown from out being just a meeting and a text discussion, we know that we've transformed into the publication. One of the first earliest texts that we wanted to publish were the articles by Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht. So basically, at that very moment, we have understood that I really need to contact the author. I really need to make him aware, just to tell him that we are fascinated by his text and we really would like to translate them into Russian. And we want to publish his articles in our publication, in our journal, in our magazine. Well, the author has been really friendly. We had a certain communication on the way, and it ended up with 2011. In 2011, we have organized the big colloquium, the big workshop. We've invited SAP, and because of many different conditions came together, and all of the miracles came together, the stars went in the right position, SAP came to Kharkiv, and it was a very important event for us. The event that has really great impact for all of the people who participated in the colloquium, and I do hope that Oleksandr will tell us a little bit more about that. The very same year, 2011, I went to the US, and I really wanted to visit lectures by Hans Gumbrecht and to get this feeling to be in a place where the book was born, when all of those concepts has been flourishing, let us put it this way. And in the end, I've ended up in 2015. I went for half a year for additional training program to Stanford, and I have had a really perfect half a year together with the author, and we've ended up with really interesting interview and really great interview that has been also published in the third issue of the Koinonia magazine. It has huge success, and I even have seen a lot of references in many different scientific works that were referring to this interview, because we have discussed the future of humanities with SAP, and SAP, with all of the humor and irony that he has been very grateful in answering my questions, and actually that's brought overall the success to this interview in the end. And so, getting closer to the 2019, when Bora has contacted me in offering offering us to translate the book of Hans Humbrecht into Ukrainian, and we've decided that we need to translate basically the production of presents into Ukrainian. We've decided that we need to include the key authors for us into Ukrainian humanities sphere, and I was really supporting to this idea. And I felt that in some way that is today a personal celebration that we managed to do that 2 years afterwards. So I can see the results of all of the work, of all of the efforts included in with you can see now the final results of something that has started already in 2007. So I do hope that today we'll be able to discuss it in more details, and Ivan is going to tell us more about his challenges with translation, and yes, of course, that this book is especially challenging for a translator. That's a very complex and difficult work, because even though at the first sight I think you might not consider that, but in the end it turned out to be pretty complex. And Oleksandr will tell you a little bit more about those people who have visited our colloquium in 2011 and what was the overall idea of how this book and how the Humbrecht's concept has influenced not only the philosophers and social scientists, but how it also influenced the number of lives of people who are just changed their specialization, who have chosen their new specialization based on those days that they have spent at our colloquium back in 2011. And I would like to invite you to join this discussion. We will have the opportunity to ask the question to the author. We will have the opportunity to ask questions to us if they're going to have any questions. But I would like to pass the floor to Sap at this very moment for him to tell us a little bit about his vision of this translation of and how his vision, how his opinions have changed in these 15 years. So, Sap, floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the interest in the book. I mean, I love translating myself. I don't do it very often, but I've recently translated a Spanish 17th century text, Oráculo Manual by Gracian. And that was perhaps the most difficult work I've ever done. So Ivan and those who have made possible this translation, I really appreciate. I mean, I don't take it for granted or anything like that, and I have a first-hand experience how difficult that is. So many thanks. I mean, it's a huge credit to my thinking, to my work, and I mean it. And also, I mean, I haven't had the book in my hand yet, but this will be a presence experience, really. It looks beautiful. I mean, my wife, who is an artist, you see part of one of her artworks in the background. She has a secret ranking of the covers of my books. And when she saw the photograph of this new Ukrainian book, she thinks that is a candidate for #1 in competition with some Brazilian covers. So, okay. Now, what changed for me with this book that came out in 2004, so it's not 15 years back, as we're always discussing, but it's now a 16-year-old book, so a teenager, so to speak. I mean, so the one thing that changed, this is the original cover of the book, and you have it next to my face, and I hope everybody can see that I did not only age since 2004, since this photograph was made, but I also lost 50 pounds. And because I wanted to lose 50 pounds, I'm terribly proud of that. So this is something that changed since 2004. What changed intellectually, so to speak, I mean, you know, and this is rather lucky than not, but all of a sudden I was associated to a word. I was associated to a concept, presence. That's my concept. In a way, that's a lucky circumstance because you somehow become marketable. I mean, you become something that has an identity, but at the same time, intellectually, and Jenya knows about that from me, it also motivates this desire to escape that. Yeah, I mean, each time that you write a new book, and so now this time it's not the presence agenda, but that's difficult. I will also say, because to quote my wife once again, because modesty is not my problem. This book has been quite successful just in marketing terms. I mean, There's, so to speak, 8.5 translations, including the Ukrainian translation. I say 8.5 because there's a partial translation of 2 chapters into Croatian. And what really fascinates me, but I have no answer to this question, is that there are unusually many translations into Eastern European languages. The Ukrainian translation, a Russian translation, a Hungarian translation, a Polish translation, and a partial translation into Croatian. That is very, very unusual, and I will end up my presentation with a question. Have you an explanation for that? I don't have any other book with so many. I have one book with more translations. That's my Aesthetics of Sports, but that is not translated into, I think it's just translated into Russian, into Ukrainian, not into any other Slavic language. Okay, but what changed seriously for me? Well, seriously, on the one hand, that all of a sudden, both retrospectively and prospectively, I had a trajectory of my work, right? I mean, all of a sudden it felt, you know, I had been a long way coming to this book that so many people were interested in. So as if my life had been a teleology towards production of presence. And on the other hand, into the future, I mean, on the one hand, I tried to escape. I tried to do something different from presence. But at the same time, there was a certain feeling of unfolding something. So that has changed for me. I have more of, not an awareness of my own work. I think it's bad taste to speak about your own stuff, about your own books as work, as Werk in German sounds very authoritarian. But there is this feeling of a development, there is this feeling of an unfolding. And of course, a second thing that changed for me, I mean, once you're associated to such a concept or to such a philosophical intuition, there's a question about the potential. What can you do with it? And this is what I want to speak about in the remaining, I don't know, 15 minutes or so. I want to give you an impression of how I see this trajectory on the one hand, including the future. I mean, what's left to do. And I want to speak much more briefly about what I see is the potential of this book and of other books, what one can do with it. Okay, first about the trajectory, and this is a little bit autobiographical. As you can tell, I like to talk about myself. One shouldn't do that, but it's true nevertheless. So, my background, my family background, both my parents were the first people in their family who went to the university, and they both studied medicine. They both became very successful as surgeons, made a lot of money at some point, so we were a wealthy family. But I always had an inferiority complex at high school because my parents were not very cultivated. I mean, we had very few books at home except medical books, you know. We had one encyclopedia in 5 volumes, and we had a complete works of the German classic Schiller, which was the present that my mother had received for her high school graduation. But I hadn't read much, so when I went to high school, and I always got very good grades, but I realized how my teachers liked to engage more with kids who came from cultivated families, who really had read poems by Goethe, knew who Schiller was, had read Hegel, etc., etc. I had an inferiority complex, and I think this is why I chose to study literature, Romance literatures and German literature, and why I wanted to become a humanist. I will admit here, it's almost a confession. I mean, I'm not the typical literature professor who wrote poems when he was a teenager or who loved literature ecstatically. You know, after 60 years of doing it, I've come to love it, but this was not the primary motivation. I wanted to prove that I could do humanities too, that I could be good in the humanities too. This, however, explains, and this is where I wanted to go, that I've always been suspicious about the humanities. Yeah, I mean, I always thought, as you say in American English, there's too much hot air. I mean, that people are pretending that they have something very important to say, but in reality, it is empty. So when I was studying, you know, in Germany, in the great age of hermeneutics, I was always suspicious of this authority of interpretation. The great literary critic will tell you what Hölderlin or what Shakespeare really meant when he wrote this poem, and he will tell you how you have to read it. I didn't like this, so my first choice when I started doctoral studies was what was then the latest innovation in literary studies, reception history, reception theory. So this was the literary history of the reader. Those people, among them my doctoral advisor, whose name I will not mention because we know today that he was a full-fledged Nazi, and so I do a damnatio memoriae, you can guess the name, I will not mention it. But he would say, no, you have to be interested in the reader's reaction. So I think this is what I want to do. But it took me a short time to realize that even in that school, in the end, you had reader A saying this, reader B saying that, and then my doctoral advisor or any big authority would tell you how you really had to read Baudelaire and how you really had to read Musil, for example. And so I didn't like that. This explains, and now I come into my own trajectory, why as a young professor, a young, as you say in Germany, Hochschullehrer, in the 1980s, I was fascinated by this concept of materialities of communication, not meta-realities of communication, but materialities of communication. So we organized in a country that no longer exists, in Yugoslavia, in Dubrovnik, in Croatia of today, we organized colloquia on materialities of communication. And what was the definition? By materialities of communication, we understand everything that contributes to the emergence of meaning without being meaning itself. So you see, we wanted to get away from hermeneutics, we wanted to get away from interpretation, we wanted to get away from significance. And this turned, and this is the second step, in the 1990s when I was already in the United States. I went from Germany to the United States to Stanford in 1989, and this is the second step. My catchword became the non-hermeneutic. Yeah, the non-hermeneutic would include materialities of communication, but it was everything about literary studies, it was everything about the humanities that was not the attribution of meaning. Not because I thought the attribution of meaning had something bad, but because I thought it was too authoritative, and because I thought there are many other things interesting in the humanities. And this, as I can say retrospectively, included a third step that is perhaps the turning point in my work. I mean, from that time on, I wrote books that are on a trajectory. But I'm now mentioning a book that's also translated into Russian, but that doesn't have presence in its title. It's a book under the title In 1926. And what I wanted to achieve in this book was not an interpretation of the past, an interpretation of history. I wanted to give myself and I wanted to give my readers the possibility of immersing themselves into a year as if they had been in that, as if they had smelled, touched, seen, heard that year. This was the project of In 1926, so you can see that there is a presence dimension in this project, but this was not programmatic. I just wanted to write such a book, and this is why I chose a random year, not an important year. You know, a book on, let's say, 1933 or 1945 in German history would have been different, or 1789 in French history. No, this had to be a random year, and it was about inversion. So I was traveling with this idea of conjuring up the past, conjuring up history, not interpreting the past, with the non-hermeneutic, with materialities of communication. And here's a fourth step. Since 1977, I have always been teaching at least once per year in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. And I gave a seminar in the early 2000s in Rio de Janeiro, and all of a sudden a student tells me, why are you talking about the non-hermeneutic, about production of, about materialities of communication all the time? What you're doing is really produção de presença. I still can hear him. Production of presence. Then really, yeah, this, because I now have a definition that's no longer materiality of communication and non-hermeneutic, always negative. I have a positive description of what I want to do. But that student must have found that I was so stupid for not inventing myself this concept of materiality of communication that he never came back to my class. So it is like the unknown soldier in these monuments. I have this unknown Brazilian student whom I have to be grateful for the invention of this concept, production of presence, but I don't know his name. I can still hear his voice when I'm saying produção de presença. And so I had a concept and a point of convergence for what I wanted to do. And I started teaching that at Stanford. That is the fifth step. And then I had a colleague who still is my colleague, Joshua Landy, in the Department of French and Italian at Stanford. I said, why don't you write a book of that? Why don't you make this a book? And I said, you know, I mean, something that I already have in my head that's always boring to write this up on a book. But Josh was really kind of insisting. And I said to just get rid of Josh. I mean, I wrote the book and I wrote it up in 2 months in early 2004. So this is the book that you have now translated, Production of Presence, and this is the trajectory of this book. And it all starts out with my suspicion about the humanities being too authoritative, just always presenting you the true meaning of a text, the true meaning of an artwork. Now, as we have arrived at this point, let me give you, again, a very basic definition of presence. I mean, the definition of presence depends on a very basic, a very elementary condition of phenomenological philosophy. If you have an intentional object, and that is any perception, physical perception, that becomes an object in our mind, my voice for you now, you cannot help doing two things automatically. You cannot help not doing that. You try to interpret it. So even if you do not understand English with an American-German accent, even if you have never heard that language, at this very moment when my voice becomes your intentional object, you try to attribute meaning to that. You cannot help doing that. And at the same time, you cannot help establishing a physical, a spatial, a bodily presence to it. Yeah, you can all say how far away you are from that image on the screen that I'm seeing here myself too. You get impacted by my voice. So my voice does not only make an impression on your tympanum, on your mind, but also on your skin, for example, like any other sound. And that's precisely this body-related reaction to intentional objects that constitutes space, for example. This is what I call presence. Not in the sense that presence is more important than meaning, but in the sense that since the 17th century in European cultures, since the foundation of the humanities throughout the 19th century, this presence dimension has been bracketed. We don't talk about it, and I do think we have to talk about it when we want to really understand the humanities as a philosophical project. Once again, not because I think that presence is more important than meaning, if I make this distinction, but because I think we owe it to our objects to go this complexity. Okay, now this was the backwards part, now much quicker the forward part. As I was saying, and as Zhenya can confirm, I always wanted to escape presence. I don't want it to be nailed by this one concept, but this happens to me. What I can say is that retrospectively, all that I have written in terms of books since plus minus 2004 can be seen as an unfolding of the situation. For example, on the one side, as an unfolding of a new relationship, a different relationship to the past. I'm not saying history because I think when we say history, we already refer to a specific relationship to the past. So there is a book about the powers of philology, and in this book, I try to say what philology all is about is tangibility. It is about touching the text, about essential relationship to the text. And from there, I'm ultimately developing this idea that I already had practiced in the book on 1926 of conjuring up the past, of conjuring up something. So this is a relationship very different from a Hegelian relationship to the past, the historical worldview, where you try to extrapolate regularities in historical change in order to make a prognostic. So the presence dimension in relation to the past would be this conjuring up the past, as if you could live in 1926. But on the other hand, I think the other consequence, so one consequence for me was a different relationship to the past. The other consequence was a different understanding, a different definition of aesthetics. And that I developed for the first time in a book about sports. I've always been a very bad athlete. I've never done anything good in sports, but sports, to me, watching sports is very, very important. So I have a book under the title, translated into Ukrainian previously, In Praise of Athletic. And what I'm saying in this book is basically this: if since the 17th century Western culture has had a tendency to exclude, to bracket the presence dimension, our existence, in thinking about our existence, then we can say that all those situations where you cannot help oscillating between meaning attribution and essential presence relationship to the world are those that we call aesthetic. For example, reciting a poem and listening to the recitation of a poem. I mean, you cannot help feeling the significance, feeling the semantics, but at the same time, there is prosody that had an impact on your body. Same with music, same with painting, same with watching sports. If you watch, for example, a hockey game, ice hockey game, or a soccer game, sports that are popular in Ukraine, yes, there's a meaning attribution, there's strategy, etc., but you also have a physical relationship to this attribute. As far as the development of the relationship to the past is concerned, I've been going on with some books. One book is Our Broad Present, in which I try to argue that this relationship to the past that we call history, historicism, that had been predominating since the early 19th century in Western culture, has been replaced by a different relationship to the past, by a different temporality, that I call the broad present, and it is my intuition that my own obsession with conjuring up has to do with this different temporality of the broad present. I have another large book that is a little bit autobiographical called After 1945. And in that book, I try to argue, this is very much about my generation, that from early on, from 1968 on, we felt that there was something that was no longer functioning with historicism, with the historical worldview. Our prognostics, the Marxist prognostics, never functioned again. And that finally, in the 90s, after the implosion of state socialism, we discovered that in reality we were no longer living in the historical worldview, that we were living in a different temporality of the broad present. And tragicomically, I believe we discovered that when it was too late to do anything about it. My latest finished serious book that will come out in German translation next week at Surkamp and will come out in the English original. The English original always comes later at Stanford Press in January 2021, is also about the past. It is a book about an author whom I enormously like, French 18th century, Denis Diderot. And it is a book that tries to show how, within this different temporality of the broad present, no longer in the historicist relationship, Diderot could perhaps be an author for us today, not answering our infinitude. As far as the other branch, aesthetics, is concerned, I think a concept that has become important to me in this context, in the context of aesthetics, is the concept of intensity. I'm almost done. The concept of intensity. Recently, a book has come out in German that will be translated into English, a couple of languages, about crowds in the stadium. The subtitle is Crowds, Stadiums as Rituals of Intensity. So that is a compliment maybe to this book on In Praise of Athletic Beauty. And my present project is a book on the voice, a phenomenology of the voice, and the basic intuition is that each time we are impressed by a voice, a speaking voice, but above all a singing, triggers a very archaic level of our psyche, a very archaic level of our existence that may perhaps be the matrix, the basis of what I describe as aesthetic experience. Now, what are the possibilities of this work? I mean, in the first place, or the potential of this work, this is not for me to say. I mean, you know, I write these books because I love writing. I'm obsessed with writing. You feel free to do with them whatever you want to do with them. I mean, if they get translated, like into Ukrainian, I'm very, very happy. But I don't want to limit what you can do with these books. I mean, my impression is that this presence intuition that I have was so overdue and so natural to do that today, and I'm proud of this, I think this is the ultimate success you can have as an intellectual, it is present everywhere. For example, in Brazil, there are 2 journals of presence studies, and people no longer relate it to my name anymore. And I think that's terrific. That means that, yes, there was a concern about something that I talked about, but that was not only my main concern. And then I see just 3 dimensions where you young people could continue. I mean, first of all, to develop this different relationship to the past, this non-interpretative relationship to the past, this conjuring up relationship to the past, also in theater productions, also in reciting poetry, for example. I see this possibility of an aesthetics that's not only the aesthetics of high culture, the aesthetics of sports, for example, and aesthetics of fashion, aesthetics of design, aesthetics of gastronomy, of fantastic food, a different way of approaching great poetry just by reading it passionately. And maybe this presence approach also could have an impact on teaching. I mean, I've always been a teacher who talked too much, but the idea would be that based on presence, you don't have to be such an authority for your students. You don't have to instruct your students. You don't have to give your students your worldview. You can just point to things. Point to real things, point to material things, and point to possibilities. And this is what I hope this beautiful book that you produced, it's 2 beautiful books, can achieve in the Ukrainian context. But I will not stop, and I will finally shut up without asking me the question, do you have any clue why production of presence seemingly had such a strong resonance in Eastern Europe, much stronger than in Central Europe, Western Europe, or in the United States? I'm very proud of that, but I have no clue why this happens. Thank you so much.
Спасибо, Seb.
Thank you, Seb, for your attention. You know, we'll need to make a technical break for 5 minutes because there are some certain problems with our streaming at this moment. So 5-minute break, if I may. Yes, that this is this kind of case when the presence actually states itself, the bigger possibility than the online event. We will make a 7-minute break just to fix the sound for our online audience, and we will get back to discussion. translation means. Only when I've checked the German origins, then I've suddenly started to see the picture. And in this case, I also would like to thank SAP, because during our translation we have had around 150 letters during the translation period. What he really answered, really detailed, elaborated on my questions, on my different misunderstanding of those translated moments, why it is important for him to have this very translations of Heidegger's text. And basically that was for me that was the biggest challenge. And basically there was a lot of difficulties with chapter number 3, because I have seen that sometimes the English translation that was very important for the author is really amidst the German original. So we have tried to approve something, I have left something in the original, but still I would like to have a short quote. So when you're going to be reading, like those who are going to be reading this translation, then you will see the quotes, for example, from the introduction from metaphysics, and you will hear something like this, and I quote.
Ідея виглядання як щось побачене є визначенням постійного, поза як воно, і лише тією мірою якою стоїть навпроти бачення. Ну і це звісно...
There was a quote in Ukrainian because it was important how it sounds, and yeah, it sounds very complex. But trust me, it sounds just the same complex and just the same challenging in English original and in German original. It's much even more complex in original than in translations. And I would like to tell you that there's nothing that I've tried to invent, and there's nothing that I've tried to misinterpret. So this is maybe speaking about some of the challenges of interpretation for this very chapter, but in this moment I would like to also emphasize that the final text you're about to read, this is not just like my achievement as a translator. This is also a collective work, because a big impact to the readability of Ukrainian texts and Ukrainian Gumbrecht has been brought by the scientific editor Vyacheslav Tsiba and the literature editor, especially, you know, to make it readable for Ukrainian language was done by Oleksandr Stukalo, and I really wanted to mention them here because they're not here today physically, but I'd like to mention them and acknowledge them also. And another point that I really wanted to outline, what is very important for me as a humanities person, as an intellectual who stands on, let us say, not the opposite, but at least very different theoretical grounds than the ones that have been voiced out in the books. So what was my experience of translating this book and bringing this book to life, especially understanding the fact that I have been translating it while based in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is the base, you know, let us say, the foundation of American neo-pragmatism and philosophy that is mostly based on something that Sapp calls the meaning in the book. So for me, that was this book has become a certain challenge that I can compare with a challenge of Faust by the Mephistopheles, and in Goethe's poem Faust. So basically, that was in a certain way, you know, as I understand the concept of presence. So for me, in a certain way, there was kind of a seduction with the directness, with the discreteness and integrity of the book. So basically, I believe that I've tried to resist this seduction, and I didn't got seduced. I didn't succumb to Mephistopheles, as Faust didn't succumb to Mephistopheles, even though it turns very tragically for Faust. But I haven't succumbed to the seduction of Mephistopheles. Still, I'm really happy that this book is being published in Kharkiv, in my native city, even though I haven't been in Kharkiv for the longest period of time. And I'm really happy that it's published Ukrainian. And I'm really happy that I do hope that it will further on get us to that Gumbrecht will be read and quoted in Ukrainian further on in Kharkiv. Thank you, Ivan, and I would like to pass the floor to Oleksandr. for him to tell us a couple of interesting stories. How did that happen? How this book came into life and how the discussion of this book has influenced some certain people in this country. Good evening. Good evening. It's really hard for me to speak up because I have to be turning from one side to another to take a look at SAP and to take a look at the audience. But best of all, let us get oriented in space. I think that SAP doesn't know that we're currently located in a very specific place, because this space is a co-working space that is worked in the framework of one Kiev company, that company that deals with logistics. And this is the space for educational programs and many different cool, interesting things. The people who have got here, I didn't manage to get to know most of the people here, but most people who came here are not philosophers, are not philologists, and it is very important. Because here we have people who are dealing mostly with art, if I understand it clearly. So most of the people who are dealing with art, who are working with art, so this is the publishing house that published this translation, so this is the publishing house that deals with contemporary art and deals with the work about cultural policies and contemporary art. So I really wanted to kill two birds with one stone. So first of all, to invite you to celebrate the publication of this book, and to answer SAP's question, or maybe to have an offer for an answer, what is happening in Eastern Europe, why this book has been relevant and interesting for the Eastern Europe, why it's not a book written by a philologist, not a philosophical book that's written by a philologist, but this is a book that gives you a bigger understanding for the contemporary art and culture understanding and appreciation, and for better appreciation of our life. I will give just an overall judgment to start with a statement. There are some good books that are very good books, and they're great books. Great books are not about being classical books. Great books that have given you some significant knowledge and have changed you in some specific way. For a very long time, I thought that, my relations with the production of presents are very intimate relationship, but I have understood that this is some kind of a generational sign for me. And this revelation that I would like to comment more. I will start with the rumors. I have heard Gumbrecht's name at the very first time, not because I've read it in some article or in some certain book, or I have seen his translation. Every time there were just rumors. The first time I have heard a rumor of him in 2003, I was invited to Kiev Mahila Academy to read out a lecture on what do I think about the contemporary Ukrainian arts, and I have read a lecture on Pavlo Markov, who is a famous Kharkiv photographer. I really wanted to explain what significant things are happening in the artistry of Pavlo Markov, not just because he's an important artist for Ukrainian culture right now, but because of his artistic legacy. We have a new understanding of what is currently happening in the contemporary art. I have been telling that to students of Kiev Mahila Academy. Then a girl came up to me and she said, were you just retelling the book of Gumbrecht? So that was the very first time I've heard that name. I thought that I was sharing some kind of intimate thoughts and opinions, but it was not like that. A couple of years later on, there was a lecture in a Ukrainian village. In Ukrainian village, there was a lecture in the framework of the Orthodox Church that was dedicated to the current Orthodox theology, and I thought that I was telling some certain very important things for me. The very same story, a completely different lady came up to me and said, I'm sorry, but by the way, everything that you have been telling, you have been actually retelling the production of presents by Gumbrecht. At this very moment, I was really interested in that. I really wanted to see the book. The very next day, the book has came to me to Lishnya village of Makariv district of Kiev region. And in 2-3 days, we have started to read this book, and started to take a closer look at this. And it has been a tremendous effect on that, tremendous impact. Having read this book in 2007, I really would like to explain this impact that it had. I do believe that this was a generational story for me, because maybe for the overall Eastern European experience and Eastern European countries, this trauma of leaving the Soviet space meant made some euphoria, a dubious euphoria in my opinion. I've started to do philosophy in 1993, and I have seen this. And I have seen the stage when the only way of thinking was to be a postmodernist. So everything that we study was postmodernism, post-structuralism. So it was like different funny story, like Jacques Derrida coming to Moscow, wanting to discuss the issues and ideas that are relevant for him in 1990s. But everyone are only discussing the ideas that he was interested in 1970s. So that was a big pleasure for us that everyone is still fascinated by your works that are 20 years old already, but that's strange. So we were located in a space when we were really enthusiastic to read out the books that were already 20 years old by that period of time, and it really didn't seem relevant to everything that was going on in real life. And we had this certain culture of protest, and we felt that there are certain phenomena in the culture that cannot be explained by the postmodern terminology, by the French post-structuralists. Now, some certain things are happening that you're using the templates that were never proved for these ideas, and trying to find the language to identify what was happening at the end of 90s and beginning of 2000s at our space was facing with the same problem. The language that we know does not fit. We need to find different language and different terminology. And so each and every one of us was looking for those opportunities to find a good elaboration on what was going on in culture, in literature, education, in politics. We couldn't find the words, we couldn't find the language, but this book worked as a dramatic shift for me. That's not just a book that told us the story of the European humanities, but it actually was the opportunity to receive a certain new language, new words that we can use to discuss of what is happening around us in the culture. It was really resembling us with the effect like you suddenly have been given the right words to use. Like, there are certain tryouts to talk, like, the person, like dyslexic person, you cannot find out the right words with something what is going on, but now you see that you can talk about it with clear language. You can ask the right questions and discuss what is going on. And it was clear straight away that this book is not about the history of literature, not that much of the overall destiny for the humanities, but it was the book of some kind of new sensation, about new sensitivity that already appeared but needed a new language. If we can identify this shift in a couple of minutes, like what was at the very beginning before the production of the presents and afterwards, then I will try to do it very briefly. I believe that that's something that we were living inside of the 90s. It is called, in the production of the presents, is called the constructivist vertigo. So the constructivist vertigo, there was something that we were experiencing at that moment. We believe there's no reality because we only have language. And we needed to spend years and years in order to understand that when we believe that we're dealing with reality, we're actually dealing with language and interpretation. We have thought and considered that there is not that just that reality doesn't exist. We also thought that a person, human, doesn't exist. So we have to celebrate all of the humanities apocalypses. So basically, apocalypses, you can celebrate the end of history, the end of art, the end of science, the end of human. And if you're worth of something, if there is some value for you, then you have to discover a couple of other ends of something, because you can never make it to a PhD without that. So overall, being enthusiastic about the end of everything was the overall tone for that. The reality has ceased to be. Everything is closed, everything is finalized. And the third point that was really important for this stage, at this territory, not very mainstream thing, let us say more or less marginalized, but very important for me, it turned out that you cannot discuss the issue of God, because all of the conversation of God was about the idea of God. And of course, in the 90s, it's not only celebrated the end of history, but the end of God as well. Why not, in the end? But out of sudden there was a certain different author to consider everything that was going on around us in the destiny of the generation from the point of view of the production of the presence. What it turned out to be that reality is not something passive, of something that we would like to study, would like to experience or know. That is something very active, that is constantly producing these effects of presence that touches us and changes us. It turned out that starting from this very moment, from the very beginning of the 2000, it's not interesting in studying new concept theories and paradigms. Not a single intellectual decided to come up building up certain theories, isms and approaches. It turns out that is much more delicate, much more touching and much more relevant intuition. That you should not produce ideas, but you should produce the opportunity for perception. So culture as cultivating your perception, finding your precepts, building your sensitivity towards the effects of presence, it has become the aim, it has become the new opportunity, the new cultural practices overall. And at this very moment, finally, on theology in that, but we'll not discuss it today. But I would like to discuss one event today. When the book came out, what was really important for us that, we're reading different books, we're reading something all the time, but it's not that there is the moment when you can discuss an important books with your friends, because we're reading different books. So the production of present, that was this rare books that you wanted to discuss with different people, with people who are doing different things. They find their own common language there. And at this very moment, we had this workshop organized in Kharkiv that was dedicated to the philosophy of otherness and the theology of communication. We have read this book, but we thought that if we're speaking of presence, then we cannot just read this book straight away. We have to try to get the author to come to us. So in 2008, 2009, it didn't seem possible. This idea seemed absurd, specifically for Kharkiv, just writing a letter to the author of a book and inviting him to come up to Kharkiv on his way to us. More important thing. But this is what has happened, really. We had a significant event happening, and that has the kid to come to Kharkiv. But, a lot of things happened. Lectures happen, really good lectures happen, significant lectures happen. What is happening in Kharkiv was an unexpected event. We have understood that you cannot just invite the person for just 1 or 2 lectures or a workshop. We wanted to have a colloquium on the modern cultural policies in Ukraine. And we wanted to discuss it not with politicians, not with the managers, but with the people who produce the real culture, who are actually dealing with the cultural policy. And we've managed to invite unbelievably great people to this discussion. And throughout of this team, throughout of this discussion in many days, we have collected a lot of things and a lot of impact. I have to maybe outline what was the most important event for me was the meeting between Gumbrecht and Pavlo Markov, because out of these meetings a lot of significant and meaningful things were born. The art was born out of it. There was Pavlo Markov was also present there, and at this there was a lot of ideas that came into life about what those ideas mean for the gallery space, for the development of the and the space is connected to the contemporary art. Was Konstantin Sigov together with Professor Ivashchenko, who came from Kyiv Academy, and as it turned out, many years later on, Ivashchenko was to blame that the students of Kyiv Academy, the girl students of this generation, they've asked all the people who've asked whether you have read Hans Gumbrecht, because we know you have read Gumbrecht first in Ukraine, and we know this person by name. And Vakhtan Kibuladze, who's a Ukrainian translator, who at this moment was the first person who have encountered Gumbrecht's articles, who had brought it to Ukrainian field also. But there is one important thing I wanted to say about this colloquium. In some certain sense, that all of this story is a fable about what cultural policies are in Ukraine. Because frequently we think that this is some kind of a story of institutional capacities building. Yes, of course, in a way it's like that, but of course there are some certain publishing houses that spaces that were located right now. A lot of other institutions are here also, but when the institutions come up, it's important to know where they're coming from. They're never being born from a sole desire to create an institution. All of the healthy institutions are built on friendship, on a desire of friends to get together and to discuss on something that is really important, on something that really touches them and gets them into that combines many different disintegrated things. What has happened, what has started in 2007 and 2011 in Kharkiv has brought a lot of continuation. So right now we're celebrating the publishing of this beautiful book that was basically the continuation of those events. Hans has been to Ukraine a couple of times, I guess in 2015 was the last time, if I'm not mistaken, 2015. After Maidan, a couple of times we've been in Kharkiv also, been in Kiev, and just wrapping up, just summing up, I would just like to say that all of this story is not the story of certain ideas, or it's not the story of the journeys of the people who've been developing so that theory, intuition, or concept. That was an example of one cultural shift being implemented into language, and throughout this thank you. And right now we have this nice time for questions from the audience. Question from the audience. Yes, we'll have the questions from the audience. So this is the high time to do that. Do you have any questions? Yes, Sap, I think we'll pass the floor to you.
I didn't have a question really, but I would like, because I thought what Filonenko said was just very, very beautiful. I mean, in the first place, it's an obligation to say that, but maybe it was true for me for the first time in my life. What you said about the impact of the book was really humbling. I mean, you have invited me. I was at this beautiful, beautiful colloquium that you talked about. It was intellectually important to me. Actually, the one photograph I always send when publishers or somebody for an announcement was a photograph from me is a photograph that Zhenya did at Kharkiv myself. So it was a happy moment, but I didn't really know what an impact made it. So I want to thank you for that, and I also want to say, not just as a obligation to re-invite me, but I would love to come back to Ukraine, back to Kharkiv above all. That was my first place. I can still remember that morning when you picked me up at the airport. And when I was touching down, I didn't really know what to expect. And then there was this intensity, but also to Kiev. But two commentaries really, because that matters to me. One about the impact of that book, or the impact of this intuition, because it's not just this book, but this intuition about presence. I mean, in the first place, I want to say, ultimately, and this is why I told you this kind of genealogy today, it all has to do, in my case, with somebody in the humanities who is not really from this cultivated social background, right? I mean, even today, I feel a little bit eccentric within the humanities because, I mean, I have not written poetry myself. I have not been the one who has always been enthusiastic about literature. I was always think that the humanities, very much in Filonenko's sense, the humanities have to do something more concrete, more intense than just all this humanities talking. And maybe as a reward, what you were saying, what is so beautiful, the reward of that might be that they have had an impact on the art scene. I mean, I've never seen this so intensely as in the Ukraine, but my colleagues and friends, for example, at Cambridge, not Cambridge, Massachusetts, but Cambridge, UK, tell me that Production of Presence is a book that's read among artists, and that makes me incredibly happy. I mean, I don't know in which way it is important for them, but there is a concreteness to this book that matters to me and that I associate with this suspicion about the humanities, that the humanities are always too lofty. And then finally, and this goes to Ivan, Ivan, a commentary about my relationship to Heidegger. I mean, in the first place, in being born in Germany in 1948, and I assure you, 1948 was not a good moment to be born in Germany. I would much prefer until the present day to have been born somewhere else. I mean, you know, I was born barely 3 years after Hitler's suicide. That's quite a burden on your small shoulders. And so, in the first place, I want to say that Heidegger, of course, biographically is absolutely somebody I despise. I mean, I tried until I came to Stanford to lead a respectable intellectual life without reading Heidegger. But here's the point I want to make, and that has to do, Ivan, with your difficulties of translation. I mean, the Heidegger who emerges in my book may not really be Heidegger. You know, there are lots of philosophers who are saying what Heidegger meant when he was using the word sein, being capital B, nobody will ever figure out. Now, what I'm doing in this book is not trying to figure out what Heidegger really meant by being. What I'm doing there is something that is considered today culturally illegitimate, but I do think it is more than legitimate, it's important. I'm saying this is how I read being. There's an inspiration coming from Heidegger, and that inspires me. And whether the concept of being I'm using in the book is Heidegger or not, I could care less. I don't mind. I mean, if Heidegger was still alive and told me, oh, you know, this is what I always meant, well, fine, I would accept that. But this is not important. And I think this is important about any type of intellectual reading. And this is important for those who in the Ukraine may read the beautiful, I hear it's a beautiful translation of my book. You have to read it your own way. What I meant in 2004 when I wrote this book is anecdotal. I could tell you lots about it, but this is not important. It is important that when you read a book, when you quote a book, that it inspires your own thought, and this sometimes in the academic humanities is not done enough. It is all about what did the author think. It is very interesting to figure out what Shakespeare was thinking. Was it homosexual desire, etc., when he was writing his sonnets? But ultimately, what matters about Shakespeare's sonnet in the year of the Lord 2020 is what you can do. And this is no different for reading Heidegger. This is no different for reading my book. This is no different for reading Zhenya's book, Ivan's book, Filonenko's books, etc., etc. The reader is the one who may be inspired by a book, but has to make not this book his own. He has to use this book in order to have his own ideas. And this is very, very important. And if I've been daring to do that in Production of Presence, in the sense of I don't care whether I got what Heidegger meant or not, I made it difficult for the translator, I know, but this was maybe what ended up being so important about this book for me, that I was fully aware that what I'm doing here is my own responsibility. The fact that it created the resonance it did makes me very, very proud, and I want to thank you all once again. Sorry, this was not a question, but it was an important point that you, Sasha, made me more aware of than I've perhaps ever been before.
So, okay, now, do we have any questions? Do we have any questions or any comments? Do we have any questions, any comments? Yes? Can you, yes, I'm doing it. Can you hear me? So, I don't know why I've only got to know you only right now, but I wanted to ask you about a certain thing. So, when I was listening to your concept of presence, I was thinking that you're constantly speaking on something that have been Just a second. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? No? So yeah, stop. Like, you can hear me now. Cool. Yeah. Like, I did nothing. Okay. Just wait a second. We'll just give the lady the different microphone because that microphone doesn't work. Like, just trying to do this question for the third time, but no, it's not about you. It's just about the microphone. Yeah, so I know that when musicians speak, then there's always the problems with the sound, and I'm a musician, that's 100%, you know, this is the effect of presence of the live sound in an online communication. I have been facing that for many, many times already. So first of all, I'm really grateful. I would like to thank you for your, you know, live presence, because not being aware about your books and about your works, I do not feel ashamed of that, and I understand that you're broadcasting this approach to life, ever-present approach to life. I wanted to ask you whether you're aware of the Nicolaus Arnoncourt concept, who has been a great musician. Unfortunately, he already died, and whether you know about the concept that is currently known as the historically informated performer, that also presupposes this effect of presence and immersion into certain epoch that has created certain sound image, because I'm really very aware of this concept and with Arnoncourt and the overall direction, and I'm working with that, and I have just understood that you're just so synchronized and harmonized with this thought, so I thought that maybe music has inspired you. Well, at least I would be really happy that you will say that yes, I know Arnoncourt, and yes, it's all about music, but maybe it's not. Thank you very much for the answer.
You don't know what the answer will be. Don't thank me before you know it. Thanks for the question anyway, because I've heard the question already. Well, remember in this presentation that I did on my work, I was trying, not in a way I always want to escape presence, but then each project that I start ends up being about presence again. So the unofficial title of what I'm doing now, a book I just started, and I just have a basic outline, is A Phenomenology of the Human Voice. This is what I want to do, and indeed in this context only, this means a couple of months ago, already during COVID times, I discovered Arnoncourt and this idea about historical performance and about immersion, and I indeed felt a great affinity. Now, this is a yes as an answer, and I completely agree with you. It is almost uncanny how much, I mean, for me uncanny to see how much we converge in certain very basic assumptions. Secondly, and this is embarrassing for me, but I cannot say that music was very inspirational for me, in the sense that something that is not clearly professional for you becomes all of a sudden important for your intellectual work or for your professional work. I mean, in my family, I have 4 children, we once discussed with my wife and my children, you know, could any of you live without music? And I was the only one, I have to say, to be embarrassed, and all my children were mad at me. So I could imagine living without music. So music has never been very central in my life, and I regret that. It's a loss. I'm not saying, but no, I cannot pretend that I'm coming from music. But, and that may be late in my life, this project about the phenomenology of the voice. Phenomenology of the voice sounds very descriptive. As I was saying before, where really my intuition about this project is that it could help discover an existential layer, an existential matrix, archaeologically very remote, very deep in our existence, that explains everything that we call aesthetic experience. And that layer has really to do with voice. And my weird hypothesis for this book is that archaeologically speaking, or speaking about very early times of Homo sapiens, maybe the singing voice, the musical voice, has a priority over the voice that articulates meaning. Maybe human voices functioned in a way attracting erotic desire, constituting space together. Maybe they functioned in a way that was existentially decisive before they became the medium of an articulation of meaning. And in that sense, the singing voice would precede the voice that articulates meaning, that articulates significance. And in that sense, I will never become a specialist in musicology, and music comes too late in my life. But in that sense, and in a strange way, I have an idea that music in the broadest sense could be decisive for what might be my final big book project. I mean, I have no intention of kicking the bucket, as we say in California, of dying soon. But this is a book that could be another 3 or 4 years until I'm really done with it. I will take the time. This is why I retired 2 years ago, to have more time for books. I never have an idea of writing a concluding book, but it could well be that in this very philosophically precise sense, music would turn out to be the ultimate matrix of what I have been working on, what I have been thinking about, without me having an existentially close relationship to music. I hope this was not a bad answer in the sense that I couldn't fulfill the expectation of coming from music, but I have a strong inspiration and intuition that this is where I'm now going.
Well, I was really happy to learn this kind of answer. This is basically my present for life, and I know that in the attendants of the opera theaters and the concert halls who are listening to you, they already had bought the rights for your future books, because you're giving this precise explanation on why, like, the operas are going to be continuing to exist, why the concerts will exist. Then you should not think of anything more. You just have to buy the rights for your books and to reproduce, rebroadcast it in your own institutions. Thank you very much. I'm really hoping to get your next book soon. Be inspired.
That's not part of the discussion. I mean, I have actually written recently for a Swiss newspaper an outline of this project, Phenomenology of the Voice. And now that I have your question, that was, as you could see, very inspiring for me, I would love to send you the manuscript of that outline. In case you don't read German, I can do a Google translation. I would like to get your opinion on that outline. So if you ask somebody, Zhenya or whoever, for my, or Ivan, for my email address, and you just send me your address, I will, before the Californian day is over, send you this manuscript. Your question was really so interesting that I would really like to get your opinion. Okay?
Sure, we'll do that.
So will we have any more questions? Does anyone else have a question? Okay, yes, we see some questions coming. Can I do the question in English?
Yeah, of course, fantastic.
Okay, hello, good evening. First of all, thank you very much for being present. And thank you for writing such an intellectually provocative book. Basically, I have kind of two theoretical questions. The first has to deal with the fact that as somebody who is campaigning against metaphysics, against the very idea of the, so to say, Cartesian outlook, you seem to be remaining in the basic framework of Cartesian metaphysics. You seem to be remaining in the basic dualities of subject and object, in a way of meaning and presence, and I'm wondering if you, after all those years, still consider this to be a suitable conceptual apparatus to, so to say, transform the way we approach the world, because basically what your account of presence is a negative account of meaning, is something that denies the subject-object epistemological paradigm, and in a way it's always been there. Like, it's kind of, as Ivan has mentioned in the afterword, it's kind of post-Kantian, when it relates us to some other kind of relation to the world, like to the thing in itself, to the religious experience, to the aesthetic experience. And for the last 200 years, this experience was bracketed as aesthetic, religious, ethical maybe, but it was always there. And what you're trying to emphasize, also bracketing the the importance of presence and leaving it to the aesthetic, to the experience of sport events, to the experience of art. Basically, you're remaining in the modern framework. And the second question is how to reconcile you basically terminologically remaining in the modern framework with your idea of what you call the ending of the chronotome of the historical time of this collapse of the usual spatial and temporal frameworks. How is this, because that's how I read it. I read it as meaning no longer being distant, as failing both to have mediated, failing, so say, both to have a mediated access via concepts and to feel the presence, so like both the relations of meaning and the relations of presence collapse in a way. And I wonder how you can reconcile this collapse with the framework of duality of meaning and presence you still conceptually operate within. Thank you very much. I hope it was at least remotely clear.
It was more than remotely clear. It's also not the first time that I get this question. I may have never gotten it in such an articulate way. Congratulations. It is the toughest question you can ask me, but I will try to answer honestly, and of course not making as many words that they could fill 2 volumes as long as the more than 1,000 pages of Jürgen Habermas's book about metaphysics and modernity, his latest book that I finished reading superficially yesterday. Anyway. So in the first place, you're perfectly right in your description that I'm always articulating what I want to articulate on the negative side of the metaphysical tradition. I will avoid the word metaphysics. I say rather Cartesian, because metaphysics is one of those words like concepts like symbol, etc., that has 43 different meanings, and whenever you want to mention specific meanings, you have to provide a list of all the other meanings that you don't. So I'd say Cartesian tradition for what you call metaphysics. Yes. Remember, when I was talking about my own genealogy, I was talking about why I was so happy when the student in Rio said production of presence. Because all of a sudden it was no longer the non-hermeneutic. And the non-hermeneutic is typical for what you're saying. All of a sudden I had production of presence. When I was listening to Filonenko, I was kind of happy because he said, you know, that provided some concepts to some artists, etc., etc. But you are right. In a way, these concepts are not what they would ideally be. Concepts beyond, concepts in a new dimension that is no longer within this Cartesian realm. Perfectly okay. I mean, I also use formulas in production of presence and otherwise, like saying there is a craving, a desire, intellectual desire for reality, capital R, in full awareness of its impossibility. Now, such a formula is still within this negativity. You are perfectly right. The question that I really have, not a question to you, but to myself also, and also to you, and it's not an excuse, is whether what you desire, conceptuality that you desire, that I desire, would not ultimately be a conceptuality beyond the Western tradition of philosophy. Beyond the Western tradition of philosophy, a conceptuality that perhaps people who have not been brought up in the academic tradition of philosophy that I've been brought up to would be more talented to write. Most recent small book that I finished, that I mentioned, is this book about stadium crowds, stadiums as ritual of presence. It's not much in a way a book about sports, it's not another aesthetic of sports, but I just try to describe there as precisely as I can this intensity that I feel when I'm physically in a stadium, when I'm physically part of a crowd of 83,000 or however many people in a stadium. While I cannot help using the concepts that I have been developing. I sometimes feel that I have managed in some parts of the book not to go beyond that, not to create, I mean, I will never be able to do that, but to get into a conceptuality that is maybe no longer only negative. I just try to describe what happens to me when I'm in a stadium. This is in the first place. Second answer, a little bit shorter. Yes, definitely. That is in a way the promise of this intuition about us no longer living in the chronotrope of historicism, of the historical worldview, the broad present. One of the consequences of the broad present that I cannot develop here, but I have tried to develop in that little book, is precisely to say, in the broad presence, our self-reference is no longer a purely Cartesian self-reference. It is a self-reference where the soma, where presence, where the body is coming back. And that would then imply precisely the chronotrope is related to what you are saying about my discourse, about my conceptuality. That would mean that living in that chronotrope, living in the broad present, would come with the obligation is a strong word, but would come with a desire for a different discourse of describing what we used to call philosophy. In our short break this morning, I had a brief conversation with Zhenya. I was saying, I think, in a way that institutionally, even at a place like Stanford or Harvard or Yale, the humanities are imploding. I think the humanities as humanities may disappear. And maybe what is valuable about this tradition will be continued in an institutionally different context, no longer as academic humanities, maybe much more in galleries, in artist studios, etc., etc. And that could be, I think, the place where a different discourse can emerge. It's probably too late in me for the game, but if Oleksandr, in his description of the impact that some of my thought has had in the Ukraine, was not only too friendly, then I would be quite happy to have made the limited, you're perfectly right, the limited contribution that I've made. And this is not an excuse, it's just what I think is the case.
I think we have some time for like 1 or 2 questions, if we might. Yes, okay, we have the question.
They're very, very good.
Good evening. My question would be simpler, I hope, for all of us. So it concerns
The previous one was the most complex that I can imagine.
Yes, I guess so. So it concerns your concept of presence in general. How do you think, is it possible to develop this aesthetic relation to the objects which are kind of inscribed into our everyday relations? So I mean the ones which are of instrumental function, which are constrained by their material properties, which don't demand something like aesthetic presetting, contrasting the art objects which you've described, for example, music, art as painting, or even fashion, sport, or cooking, which are off art sphere and which are estimated as art. So what's your opinion on our these very everyday interaction?
Yeah, I mean, many thanks, because this is as complex a question as the previous one, but I think I have a more concrete answer to that. Remember, at some point the concept of aesthetics, the word aesthetics, the way we use it, does not go to ancient Greek. It is not aesthesis. Yeah? It's a different, it was invented, as we know, in the early 18th century in a master's thesis, so I hope for everybody who's writing a master's thesis. Now, then, I think it was a concept for those situations where exceptionally there was not only meaning and rationality, but that which was bracketed, the presence dimension, was also present. Yeah? I mean, this is why I always talk for situations of aesthetic experience of an oscillation between the meaning dimension and the presence dimension. This is what then Kant describes in the third critique, this is what Schiller is engaging with, etc., etc. This is the concept of presence. But in that tradition, and in that tradition that was related to the historical worldview, situations of aesthetic experience were always specific. They were always separate from the everyday. Yeah, I mean, they were always autonomous, as Sheila would call it, die Autonomie der ästhetischen Erfahrung. Yeah. Now that, I think, has changed precisely within the different chronotype, within the chronotype of the broad present. If my intuition is correct that within the broad present, and this doesn't depend on our philosophical thought, just in our everyday, the body is back, the soma is back. You know, jogging all of a sudden matters enormously, fashion matters enormously. Then it means that what in my definition would be aesthetic experience is no longer isolated, no longer enjoys or is condemned to this autonomy from the everyday, but, and I have been trying to describe that, we could say that today, for the first time since the 17th century, our everyday is permeated by phenomena that we can, according to that definition, call aesthetic. Yeah? Fashion would be something. All of a sudden, there are long discussions in the German media about the uniforms of male persons. Yeah? I mean, this 10, 20 years ago, this would not have been a discussion. All of a sudden, that matters. Or, for example, I can still remember when I first came here to California, there was a catering company in San Francisco called edible art, eatable art, so food as art, and I thought this was idiotic. Today, to say that a high-level dinner or lunch of food is aesthetic experience is completely normal. So I do think that the social place, so to speak, the symbolic social place of aesthetic experience has begun to change. I always wanted to say that I'm focusing so much on sports. Well, of course, it has to do with the fact that I love sports, and I think that's quite legitimate. And watching sports, and that's quite legitimate. But also not to redeem sports and say, oh, this is also aesthetic experience. But to say that this is typical, that a context, the social context, the cultural context, that traditionally had nothing to do with aesthetic experience, with the autonomy, was as far away from that as we could possibly imagine, is today a place of aesthetic experience. And whenever somebody says, well, my team lost, but I still enjoyed the game, or, you know, whatever team that may be, or my favorite artist lost, but it was a great race, then you can realize that what fills the stadiums is a no longer autonomous form of aesthetic experience, and that is no different with pizza places, with people who enjoy pizza, people who enjoy fashion, and so forth and so forth. Bottom line, I would say the formula of aesthetic experience today is not there. It's autonomy. There was nothing bad with this autonomy, but today the everyday is permeated with aesthetic experience. I mean, that is at least my intuition, and I hope, again, a too long but relatively concrete answer to your question.
And I think we'll have the final question for today. Like, there was this...
Okay.
About pandemic? No, you don't want to have a question on pandemic? And
Try to do with what I can do.
Но мы тоже не...
no, it's just that we do not really want to discuss the question of pandemic, but we have to. There's just one very, very simple question. 10 years ago, in Kharkiv, we have discussed the situation with education, and it was quite obvious at this moment that there are two trends. The education that has presence in it, the presence of the educator, and the education that is getting rid of an educator, of the teacher, and gets into the space, let us say, gets into the virtual space. And we all have gone through this, go through this anxiety that there is some kind of, phantom hanging over us, that we're getting, that this education that is outside of presence is being developed. But what we're going through in 2020, I believe has changed this opposition that we had before. And so we're going through that like very precisely. And what's very interesting to know what has changed. What has changed in our life, how the pandemic has changed our life, how the pandemic has changed our life, especially in the notion of education as presence.
Yeah. Okay, in the first place, it's horrible if authors always refer to their own books, but the small book on stadium crowds, which was not a book that I wrote because of the pandemic. I planned it anyway to write it in April and May of this very year, but it turns out I was writing it during the pandemic. So in this book, which will come out in English within a couple of months, I mean the original version is in German, Crowds, the title is English, but it's Crowds, Stadien als Rituale der Intensität. It's appeared in Klostermann, where the Heilige complete works come out. That book formulates an answer, but here is my reaction to your situation. So as I was mentioning before, especially under American conditions, I do think that it is plausible and inevitable that part of what we call education, call it academic education, has been, in the metonymic sense of the word, downloaded on electronic transmission, on remote teaching, and that was already the fact before Corona, before COVID. And as this is so much cheaper than a Stanford tuition costs $66,000 per year. And by the way, I mean, if your family doesn't have enough money, the university doesn't ask it, but the value is so high. So, I mean, online education for everything that is sheer transmission of knowledge. Medical school, the introductory course into anatomy, I think that can be done. Many introductory courses can be done online. There is a loss, but I think this is okay. And this is inevitable, and this will also make education more democratic, more accessible for people who cannot pay tuition or cannot afford to live at a different place, etc., etc. But, and this is of course where your question was going, all of us who have either been teaching and have gotten an existential kick out of teaching, or have been on the receiving side and believe, oh my God, this was a great seminar, this was a fantastic lecture. We all know that there is something to a cultural situation, to a teaching situation, to a seminar, and I would call it X, that we would lose if everything was online. But at the same time, that is very, very difficult to describe. I even think nobody has described it well. And because nobody has described it well, the danger is greater that it may disappear because online education is so much cheaper. So I know for my part, I mean, I hope you see that I've really been enjoying what I've been hearing. I've been really enjoying the question. But this discussion that we are having would be different for me if I was physically present in Kiev or in Kharkiv. And it would be different for you too to have me physically present. Perhaps it would be worse, I don't know, but it would be different. I mean, the image of me that you see on the screen with a fraction of a second of delay is as close as we can get, but I'm not sitting with Filonenko, with Zhenya, and with Ivan there on the panel. I'm not sitting there. And it is very difficult to describe what is different. But I know, for example, we have, as Zhenya knows, every Thursday night at Stanford PRG, the Philosophical Reading Group. And there are certain evenings when the Philosophical Reading Group is so intellectually explosive, very difficult to describe what happens, that when we leave the room, we are all kind of intoxicated. You know, I'm always happy that I have to walk 10 minutes to get to my car because I would not be a good driver. So there is an effect of presence that is very specific, and an effect that in Corona times, we are losing on the one hand, and we are appreciating more than ever before on the other hand, because real encounters, physical encounters with people have gotten much less frequent. So I have to say, in our family, you know, we have this nice parlor outside this room where we have dinner, and the dinners have gotten longer, and we appreciate more sitting together, where at the same time, being together physically in presence does no have learned to appreciate this presence effect more. Yeah, I would love to be in Kiev if I could travel transatlantically, which is basically impossible. I would love to be there more than ever before. And at the same time, given the institutional situation, it is more important than ever before to try and develop descriptions and concepts and discourses that can really convincingly describe, circumscribe, and define what is this X effect. Why being together is really intellectually more sufficient, not only intoxicating, but intellectually more productive. Why in this philosophical reading group I have had so many ideas for my own work that I call it my intellectual life. I think nobody knows that precisely, but we have to go there. I basically believe, and that would be a starting point, that it has to do with the fact, with the philosophical circumstance, that in a situation of shared presence, we constitute space, existential space, jointly. That is not happening now. I mean, as you see me on the screen, but I'm not with you in the same space. I'm not part of us constituting jointly existential space. What that means for the production of ideas, I don't know yet, but I think this would be a starting point. Constitution of existential space in real presence. A starting point to develop, to fill out this void of the factories. We all know by intuition that it is more productive, more existentially satisfying to be together in real presence. But at the same time, we shouldn't act as if we knew exactly what that is. So maybe that's indirectly a good reason to try and come to Ukraine again to discuss jointly in Kiev and in Kharkiv.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone who's joined us here today. Thank you very much, Seb, for joining us here today. We really tried to get everyone here together, at least this in one room, to get us all together, to be present, to come from Kharkiv and to spend this time, to dedicate this time to this presentation. And I believe that in some way that this is our way to say thank you for you having written this book. So thank you once again to all of the people who have been present here today, and thank you very much for you enjoying this conversation, hopefully.
And let me say I've been enjoying this enormously. Now my working day, my Californian working day starts. It's 11:05 a.m. But you will stay with me throughout the day as if you were present. Thank you so much.
So we would like to invite you for the final glass of wine.
I cannot be with you.
Bye.
Thank you. And thanks for the translation. It was absolutely stunning. It was really, really beautiful. Thank you and bye-bye.